The recycled air tasted of ozone and compromise, a metallic tang that coated the back of the throat and never quite left. It was the flavor of survival in the hegemony, the taste of every breath, borrowed against an ever-increasing debt. Kael drew it in, held it, and let it out in a slow, controlled stream, watching the condensation ghost across the inner surface of his helmet. Outside, beyond the triple-pane plasteel of the observation dome, the universe was laid bare in silent, brutal perfection. A velvet so black it seemed to absorb the very light from his eyes, punctured by the diamond-hard glitter of 1 billion indifferent suns. Earth, a swaddled blue and white marble, hung like a locket in the void, a constant, taunting reminder of a life he no longer possessed a right to. He was tracing the Terminator's slow crawl across the curve of the planet when Sloane's voice crackled in his calm, sharp and unwelcome as a static discharge. Staring at what you lost, Voss, or just admiring the quality of hegemony brand glass? Kael didn't turn. His reflection stared back at him from the viewport, a hollow-eyed ghost superimposed over a dying world. The faint scars on his cheek, souvenirs from a pressure suit malfunction years ago, were etched in pale silver by the starlight. "Just confirming it's still there," he said, his own voice a low rasp through the helmet's internal mic. "Propaganda says it's a paradise. I like to check for scorch marks." A sigh, tinny and exasperated. He could picture her perfectly, leaning against a support strut, arms crossed over the chest plate of her vacuum suit, a permanent crease of disapproval between her brows. Her idealism was a weapon she wielded with all the subtlety of a plasma torch, and he was tired of being burned by it. "There's still good down there," she said, the statement less a belief and more a challenge. "People worth fighting for. Everyone's worth fighting for, until you have to do the actual fighting. Then you learn about acceptable losses." The words left a taste in his mouth fouler than the recycled air. They were true, and that was the problem. Truth, in Kael's experience, was a blunt instrument, best used for breaking things like hope or a medic's stubborn optimism. He shifted his weight, the seals of his suit groaning in protest. The lunar dust, a fine gray powder like powdered bone, crunched under the magnetic soles of his boots. It got into everything: suit joints, air filters, nutrient paste. A constant, gritty reminder of their exile. "That's the dishonorably discharged officer talking," Sloane countered, her voice softening just enough to find the seam in his armor. "Not the man. There's no difference," he lied. The lie was heavy, a solid thing he carried in his gut. It was the same lie he told himself 1,000 times, in the crushing dark of the Pacific Abyss, in the sterile interrogation rooms of the hegemony, in the roaring belly of the troop transport that had spat him out onto this desolate rock. The pressure of 1,000 atmospheres was nothing compared to the weight of one lie. Before he could formulate a suitably cutting response, a low hum began to vibrate up through the soles of his boots. It wasn't the familiar thrum of the outpost's life support. or the distant growl of the regolith processors. This was a new sound, a deep, resonant frequency that seemed to bypass the ears and settle directly in the sternum. It was the sound of a giant tuning fork struck against the fabric of space. Then came the alarm. It wasn't a siren, a wail that rises and falls with predictable urgency. This was a klaxon, a brutal, serrated shriek that tore through the quiet of the outpost like a physical blow. It was the sound of catastrophic failure. A jagged, pulsing blast of pure electronic panic designed to sever thought and trigger primal flight. Red light bled from emergency emitters along the curved walls of the dome, strobing in time with the noise, painting the lunar landscape outside in washes of apocalyptic crimson. The universe, moments ago a silent tapestry, was now a blood-soaked, screaming nightmare. Training buried under years of bitterness and rust took over. His body moved before his mind could object. He pivoted, dropping into a low crouch, rifle snapping up to his shoulder. His helmet's HUD flickered to life, tactical overlays scrolling across his vision, air pressure stable. Structural integrity nominal. No external contacts. The data was clean. The alarm was lying. Report. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Valerius, a man whose spine was forged from hegemony policy manuals. His command was a thin reed in the hurricane of noise. Kael's eyes scanned the dome. 5 other members of their squad were present, all recycled, all moving with the jerky, uncertain motions of soldiers who didn't trust their gear, their leaders, or the ground beneath their feet. And then he saw Jax. The kid was standing near the central console, frozen. His face, visible through his clear faceplate, was a mask of chalk-white terror. His eyes, wide and unfocused, were staring at something beyond the dome, beyond the moon, beyond the veil of reality itself. His mouth was open, but no sound came out. Jax. Sloane was already moving toward him, her medical training overriding the chaos. Jax, what is it? As she reached him, the kid's back arched violently. A scream, thin and raw, was finally torn from his lungs. It was a sound of such profound agony that it momentarily cut through the blare of the klaxon. He wasn't screaming in fear. He was screaming in pain, as if his nerves were being individually set alight. "A hole," he gasped, his voice a strangled whisper that was somehow perfectly clear over the comms. A single lucid thought in a sea of noise. A hole in the sky. It's tearing. He collapsed. Not a feint, not a stumble. One moment he was upright, rigid with tension. The next, his limbs gave out as if every wire connecting his brain to his body had been simultaneously severed. He hit the deck, plating with a sickening thud of armor on metal. Sloane was on him in an instant, her hands flying over the seals of his helmet to retract the faceplate. "He's seizing," she yelled, her voice tight with professional focus. "Get me a med kit." "Oh. Now, Voss, help me," hold him down. Kael was already there, dropping to one knee beside her. He holstered his rifle and placed his hands on Jax's trembling shoulders, pinning him against the floor. The kid's body was a live wire, convulsing with an unnatural, rhythmic violence. A thin line of foam bubbled at the corner of his mouth. His eyes, rolled back in his head, showed only the whites. This wasn't epilepsy. Kael had seen seizures on the battlefield before, triggered by neurotoxins or concussive blasts. This was different. This was an electrical storm inside the boy's skull, and something had thrown the switch. The static, Jax mumbled, his teeth chattering. The shore. It's a static shore, and it's breaking. His words were nonsense, the synaptic misfirings of a brain under siege. But Kael felt a cold dread crystallize in his gut. The linker. The officer on Ganymede had called him a psychic sensitive to the hive mind's bioelectric field. Kael had dismissed it as more hegemony pseudoscience, a way to justify weaponizing a sick child. Now, as the outpost continued to scream its electronic terror and Jax vibrated under his hands, he wasn't so sure. Valerius shut off that goddamn alarm. Kael barked into his comm, his old command tone surfacing from the depths. It's not helping. We have a medical emergency. Negative, Voss. Valerius's voice was strained, panicked. All systems report a Class 1 gravimetric anomaly forming in high orbit. Standard procedure wasn't written for whatever this is. Kael countered, his knuckles white, where he gripped Jax's armor. The kid is our only early warning system, and he's frying. Turn it off. There was a moment of hesitation, then a click. The klaxon died. The sudden, profound silence that rushed in to fill the vacuum was somehow more terrifying than the noise. It was a heavy, listening silence, thick with anticipation. The only sounds were Jax's ragged, hitching breaths and the frantic clicks and beeps of the medical scanner in Sloane's hand. The red emergency lights continued their silent, rhythmic pulse, bathing everything in blood. What do you mean, a gravimetric anomaly? Sloane asked, injecting a stabilizer into Jax's thigh. The boy's convulsions began to subside, replaced by a deep, shuddering tremor. Look, another soldier breathed, his voice trembling. He was pointing a shaking, gauntleted finger toward the viewport. Kael followed his gaze. He looked past his own spectral reflection, past the comforting blue orb of Earth, and into the deep, absolute blackness above the lunar horizon. At first, there was nothing, just the cold, indifferent stars. Then he saw it. It wasn't a light or a ship or anything solid. It was a distortion, a patch of space 100 kilometers wide, where the stars seemed to bend, like looking at the ocean floor through a column of superheated water. The light of distant galaxies was being warped, smeared into painterly streaks. It was subtle, a barely perceptible shimmer against the void, but It was growing. A low hum returned, not just through the floor, but through the very air in the dome. It was a bass note played on an instrument the size of a planet. A vibration so deep, it felt like the moon itself was moaning. The fine gray dust on the ground outside began to shift, to dance in strange, swirling patterns, aligning itself along invisible magnetic lines that hadn't existed moments before. "What is that?" Sloane whispered, her work on Jax forgotten for a moment. She stood slowly, her eyes fixed on the spectacle in the sky. No one answered. No one had an answer. Kael's mind, a machine built for tactical analysis and risk assessment, was grinding to a halt. He had no data, no precedent. His experience encompassed the crushing pressures of the abyss and the explosive decompressions of orbital combat. He understood physics, ballistics, the simple, brutal math of war. This was not math. This was sacrilege. It was a violation of the fundamental laws that held the universe together. The shimmer in space intensified. The bent starlight began to coalesce, the edges of the distortion sharpening. It looked as if some unseen artist had taken a celestial brush loaded with liquid static and drawn a line across the sky. The line widened, thickened, and then, with a silent, terrible finality, it tore. It was not an explosion. It was an unzippering. Space itself seemed to rip open. Peeling back from a central seam, there was no light from within, no great flash of energy. Instead, the rift drank the light around it. It was a wound of absolute nothingness, a vertical gash of non-existence, slashed through the heart of the cosmos. The edges of the tear didn't burn. They shimmered with a chromatic, oily sheen, a rainbow of impossible colors that made his eyes ache. It was like watching reality bleed. "Whole!" Jax whimpered from the floor. His eyes were open now, tracking the impossible vision in the sky. Tears streamed down his pale cheeks. The hole in the sky. Kael felt a tremor run through his own body, a sympathetic vibration with the terrified boy on the floor. He had spent his life in hostile environments, surrounded by things designed to kill him. The pressure of the ocean, the vacuum of space, the focused malice of enemy soldiers. He understood those threats. He could fight them, outmaneuver them, or die by their hands in a way that made sense. This was different. This was a primal, cosmic horror that dwarfed human comprehension. It was a flaw in the steel of the universe, a crack in the hull of existence. The sight of it triggered a deep-seated, reptilian fear that had nothing to do with training or experience. It was the fear of a creature that has just realized the sky is not a ceiling, but a fragile membrane. And something has just torn it open from the other side. The rift stabilized, a silent, gaping maw hanging in orbit. It was vast, easily large enough to swallow a capital ship. It pulsed with a slow, dark energy, the colors at its edge swirling like oil on black water. The deep hum intensified, a constant pressure against Kael's skull. He felt it in his teeth, in the fluid of his inner ear. He felt small, insignificant, an organism clinging to a speck of dust, staring into the jaws of a leviathan. He forced himself to breathe, the simple mechanical act, a lifeline, in a sea of rising panic. He forced his brain to work, to categorize, to analyze. Enemy, phenomenon, act of God? The categories were useless. A child's vocabulary in the face of an eldritch text. Around him, the rest of the squad was paralyzed, their faces a mixture of awe and stark terror. Valerius was babbling into his comm, trying to get a response from command, his voice cracking with disbelief. Sloane had returned to Jax's side, but her gaze kept flicking upward, drawn back to the wound in the heavens. Kael rose slowly to his feet, his rifle feeling like a useless toy in his hands. He walked back to the viewport, planting his boots wide. A sailor finding his sea legs on a deck that had suddenly tilted at an impossible angle. He stared into the shimmering, silent tear. He thought of the abyss, the only place he'd ever felt truly alone. A place of absolute pressure and absolute darkness. He had been wrong. This was the true abyss. A place where the rules didn't apply, where the familiar constants of physics were rendered meaningless. And something had just opened a door from that place into his. The subtitle of his life, of the entire hegemony, flashed in his mind, a piece of propaganda that suddenly felt like a prophecy. Some wars are fought to be lost. He had always thought it was about sacrifice, about the noble loss for a greater gain. Now, staring at the impossible gash in the sky, he understood. Some wars are unwinnable from the start. Some enemies are not meant to be fought, only witnessed. And their war, he realized with a certainty that chilled him more than the vacuum outside, had just begun.